And we're just going to talk about her amazing book, From Kargil to the Coup. So, as you all know, Pakistan has many traditions of independent journalism, and Nasim is very much in that cadre now, having produced this book. And it is basically an account of the decision to go to war in Kargil, why it was decided, and who knew what was going on. And I think you started writing it in 2003, is that right?
Yeah.
And it was published in
2018.
2018.
Yeah. So both can be on together.
Let's try that. You switch yours on.
No.
Yep, that's good. It's got the one. Yep. There we are. How's that? Can you hear it now?
Yeah.
So it's a 15-year project, and honestly, you can see the effort that's gone into it. It is an absolutely meticulous, highly detailed account of every important conversation and every meeting that occurred in the run-up to the Cargill conflict, and indeed as the whole conflict unfolded, and how the various people reacted. And it is an absolutely, I mean, I was with someone last night at dinner explaining what the book says, to which she said, well, how could that have happened? And that's what we'll find out today. How could this possibly have happened in the way that it did? So I think most of the audience, by the looks of it, will be familiar with Cargill. Can you just give us Cargill in 30 seconds? What happened? Just the very brief contours of the conflict.
Well, basically, after the nuclear tests, I think there was a thinking within the Pakistan military command, select people, not as an institution, but among some people that, three things. One, that the nuclear test gave Pakistan the space, while the Prime Minister was looking at space for dialogue and moving forward. I think these few individuals within the army thought that this was a time to actually go ahead and utilize that opportunity to, in some ways, do what India had been doing. For example, 1984, India had gone and occupied Siachen, and there was no response from Pakistan, and in fact, the military ruler at that point had said, not a blade of grass grows there, so that's it. So I think the thinking within within these four individuals who had a background of Kashmir, of having served along the LOC, they thought this is a time when we can actually go there and basically block the lifeline of the Indian troops from Srinagar to Leh, and then bring the Indians on their knees, so to say, and then it would be a situation where the international community would panic, because the response to the nuclear test was obviously, there was a lot of panic. UNSC Resolution 1172 had actually talked about resolving issues as well, and that was the first time in 50 years that Kashmir had come to the UN Security Council's attention. So I think the thinking here was that we can actually go and get India in a tight spot, and when India's in a tight spot, whatever the reaction, the international community is going to jump in and say, now work out your differences. And at that point they thought we can get Siachen back and we can talk about,
So
Kashmir.
just to spell that out, we're talking 1984 was the Indian move on Siachen.
Yeah, occupying.
And after that, the Pakistan army drew up plans to respond, and they were plans that involved some sort of action in Kargil.
Yes, yeah, basically blocking the lifeline, that's critical.
Blocking the road up to Siachen.
And also let me add that a similar plan was presented by General Parvez Musharraf, who was then Director General Military Operations, to Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, who had said, General, you go there and then what? And the plan was absolutely
So this plan was there and had not been used for many, many years, but it had been sort of nonetheless on paper as a possibility. It had been there. The nuclear tests happened, and then it seems that things have changed. So this group you call the Cargill Clique. You refer often to the Cargill Clique. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so just another point. In October, the planning had kind of started.
October
1998, and around August, September, there was a round of dialogue between India and Pakistan over Siachen. And also keep in mind that on several occasions, almost a near agreement was reached on Siachen, and then India backed off for political reasons, etc. So the Cargill Clique, what's the Cargill Clique? How does this all start? It starts with the FCNA, Commander General Javed Hassan, Major General Javed Hassan, who first starts telling his people, individual brigade commanders that, why don't you go and occupy posts. Let me also say this, that this is a kind of a normal happening between India and Pakistan, that India comes and occupies a post and Pakistan occupies a post. Most of the times we don't hear about it, but this is something that continues to happen. So he started off by just saying, okay, let's occupy some posts, and it seems then that General Javed Hassan, who was commanding the FCNA, the force that is up in the north, based in Gilgit, and they have brigades, 3 brigades under this commander. It was him, and then General Mahmood, who was then Corps Commander, 10 Corps, again, one level above General Javed Hassan, who was again had 3 brigades under his command. And then there was, so General Mahmood, and this is the most fascinating part. General Mahmood was, he engaged with General Javed Hassan. General Javed Hassan explained to him how this was a great idea and this should be done. And General Mahmood had written this amazing book on, I think if anybody wants to read the best book on the 1965 war, it has to be his book, General Mahmood's book. And the name of the book originally was The Illusion of Victory, but then he was asked to change the name of the book, and it was called The History of 1965 War. But a brilliant book. I mean, he had access, he got documentation, etc. So he has, in fact, I was told a few weeks ago, he spoke somewhere in Lahore and he talked about 1965 and how such a disastrous decision was made. So anyway, but he in 1999 becomes part of the decision, and then you have General Musharraf, who is by then the army chief. He becomes the army chief in October. So you have these 4 men in the clique: General Javed Hassan, General Mahmood, CGS, Chief of General Staff General Aziz, and then army chief. So these are 4 men who are able to surreptitiously organize this, plan this, and I think it's important to understand that these 4 generals were men who were controlling from the GHQ downwards that entire area. So they could move around troops, etc., without the Director General Military Operations knowing about it.
So not everyone was in the picture, but nonetheless the army chief was, right? He's one of the 4 you're mentioning.
Yeah,
so
certainly.
We've got the army chief, and we've got 3 senior generals who are beginning to take some posts, move people across the line. But at that point, when they were doing it, and this is what, autumn 98? Right?
This is now October, November 98.
Have we got a sense that this is part of a decision to actually do something big in Kargil?
No, we don't have that. We don't have that sense at all. We have a sense that they're saying, okay, we'll go across, and about 200 men will be involved. They'll go across, and now you're looking at the northern areas, and you're looking at this period when it's cold and it's freezing, and it's 17 to 18,000 feet. The height of these mountains, these are rugged mountains. And I mean, let me say that in some ways, this the bravery, the courage, the conviction of these young men who actually go and occupy these posts is, it's mind-boggling. So, and so originally the idea was that few men will go and interdict that road. You interdict that road, and you needed just a few.
So they thought, okay, so the plan is sort of there, but it's just that they thought they could do it with a few hundred men.
Yeah, couple of hundred.
And when you say interdict, you're talking about blocking that road that leads up to Siachen.
Yeah, so that there's no movement of supplies to the troops Indian troops in Leh, and then the Indians panic, and you can't have flights, etc. So there's no way of moving logistics. and and so you block the supply line, and there's going to be panic.
So we've now got a sort of limited military action underway. And when did the first people cross the line of control?
Somewhere in November.
November 98.
1998. A few people, I mean, I think there's trudging along, few people, and I mean, subsequently the number grows, but 1999, preparations are being made, some weapons, some engineering requirements, etc., are being fulfilled, but it's something that is highly secretive, it's contained, and so you can imagine that the scale of it was such that nobody was alerted, because there is the MI and there is the ISI, and within the army, within the Pakistan Army as an institution, there are kind of counter intelligence going on, and you may have heard only yesterday it was announced that two serving three-star generals were picked up by the Pakistan Army High Command. They were involved in espionage. So it tells you that it's an institution that really has counterintelligence, etc., working. And so in this case, I think the scale and the way it was done was such that nobody got alerted, nobody from the intel, and even the DGMO, etc., got involved in January. Before that, even Director General Military Operations wasn't involved.
Okay, you're saying it was very tightly held secret within even the military.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what about the civilian government? Were they in any way aware what was going on?
Not at all. In fact, November 1998, there's a very important Defense Cabinet Committee meeting in which the Prime Minister, then Nawaz Sharif, says, takes three key decisions. One, that we are going to move more towards political support, diplomatic support of the Kashmiris, because keep in mind that after the nuclear tests in May 1998, by 1998 September, October, there's a kind of détente between Pakistan and India, and the world is welcoming it, and Pakistan is taking the initiatives, and Pakistan is in a good space, good diplomatic space. So, so one decision is to move towards aggressive diplomatic support for the Kashmiris, so moving away from military support. The second was to open up, to basically put pressure on the Taliban and say enough is enough, and that's something that we see happening at that point. So I have contextualized that in the book as well. And the third is on OBL, some kind of, discussion is taking place.
In the book, you've got a passage called parallel universes. So you've got this not the entire military, as it were, but the army chief and a limited group who are moving people across the line of control in Kashmir. Then you've got the Prime Minister basically pursuing a diplomatic strategy, trying to improve relations with India and culminating in the Lahore summit, right? When was the Lahore summit?
In February 1999, but the interesting thing is that in January 1999, the first major meeting takes place in Pindi, where you have a slightly bigger number, but all those who are serving under these four generals, and that's where the DGMO is also there.
So, sorry, January 99, we've got a larger group in the army become aware.
Not a large group, I'm saying younger officers.
Right.
Younger officers, the PSOs, etc., principal staff officers working with them. And you have the Director General Military Operations there as well. And so General Musharraf, the army chief, he makes this comment. He says, but are you sure that we can deal with this? I hope this doesn't, the outcome isn't the same as India's forward war against China. And just very briefly on that, in 1959, the Indians had decided along the McMahon line, there was in China and India had a problem, and what the Indians were doing was they were gradually going and nibbling away what was supposed to be Chinese territory. And when they do this in 59, by 62, the Chinese are all ready to come back and really blast the Indians. And the Indians, Ian Maxwell's, seminal work on this, he says about 8,000 Indian troops get killed, etc. So General Musharraf says, so in some ways, now what Pakistan was doing in Kargil was, was going to be nibbling and then going forward and hoping to have a strategic kind of change in the situation, status quo. So General Sharif says, are you sure this won't turn into what became of India's forward movements? And what he meant really was that the Indians will come back and really, thrash the Pakistani troops at that point. And so one general of these three generals, one says, General, it's my neck on the line. And then the other general says, no, sir, it'll be my neck. And all three generals says, and there's a chapter called Neck on the Line. So they all say it'll be our necks on the line. And so General Musharraf says, but how come this wasn't done before? If it's so simple, how come we didn't do this earlier? So this I don't have in the book. The fascinating part about this book is how many people from the army came forward to tell me more who had been part of it. But anyway, one of the...
Just to be clear about that, that's after publication?
Yeah, after.
You get more and more and more?
Yeah,
okay.
more, yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, one of the generals says, because Chief, nobody was as brave and as daring as you are, so you see, so you're the first one to do this. So anyway, sorry, you were talking about...
So we got the Prime Minister heading towards the Lahore summit when Vajpayee came here. Big deal, lot of media, and we've got the Indian and Pakistani political leaderships talking about political solutions.
Political solutions?
Political dialogue, let's say. And then at the same time, a few weeks before that, we've got a larger group in the military becoming aware of what's happening. The junior officers. Are becoming aware. And by this stage, so by, let's say, February 99, when in this city, the Pakistani Prime Minister is meeting the Indian counterpart, how many troops are across the line?
I think we're talking of dozens. I mean, I think initially, so here's, there's the euphoria stage. There's first the euphoria stage when they discover there's something that we should do and, let's do it. Then you have the excitement stage. Where they feel like this is great, they're so excited, these four men and the troops who are there and, people who are brigade commanders in that zone. They're feeling like, this is cakewalk, we can just kind of...
Because no one is stopping them.
Nobody's stopping them. And that's when, from excitement, it turns into expansion. And so that's now close to, I think, February, March is when the expansion takes place. So that's when, I think by end March, they have about 120 posts that they've occupied. And let me just explain, when we talk of posts, when you think of a post, you think of a structure, etc. But think of a post at 18,000 feet, rugged mountains, nobody living there, nothing there. So when I say post, it really means huge boulders and these men sitting behind the boulders, etc. And also just, it's not like that the preparation for the Lahore summit was taking place in isolation and that the civilians were just taking that forward. It was an institutional thing and people from the army were also involved. So it was really a national approach at that point.
That's right, the diplomatic track had a sort of military element.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, you're saying by March, so let's say within a few weeks of the Lahore summit, 120 posts have been taken, each one involving quite a few troops.
Yeah, well, about 6 to 8. No,
and with supply.
Supply lines, but
so
this is the end March or somewhere.
It's becoming quite a big operation. And I mean, one of the things that was circulating at the time, I remember, was no one is stopping us. We can just keep moving forward and the Indians are not aware and we're just moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you must have found that out in March because so many of us never realized what was happening. And it's not really until May, first week of May, when there's the encounter, and that's the encounter after expansion, then comes the encounter phase, the first time there's an encounter and some shepherds report some firing in that area, that Dras Kargil, and that's when the Indians come back and try and see what's happening. And the interesting thing is that it isn't until early June, literally, first week of June, that the Indians realize what has happened, because there were people in the Indian Army who were saying that something is happening, some activity is taking place. Brigadier Surinder Singh is one individual, and his commander, Corps Commander, 15 Corps, which is the Indian Occupied Kashmir Corps, the general says, I've given you the task to put up a zoo in Leh and you work on the zoo. Forget about this, you're just imagining this. So, I mean, you have brilliance on the Indian side as well, and obviously that whole area was left unprotected, and Indians went against their own SOPs, and they all just, I mean, so how does something like this happen? Because in winter, typically, the troops from those heights just go down on both sides. And this time, when, I mean, Pakistan had planned that when the Indians go down, they'll conduct this. And on just on this business of doing this and, conducting such operations, I remember meeting the Indian Defense Minister. He was then serving after Kargil when I was doing my research. So, Mr. Fernandez, so I said, so he said, so you guys did this, and so I said, and you did Kargil, you did Siachen. So he said, well, it depends whoever can get away with it. So that's the kind of context and the temperament in the situation.
All right, so we're getting an ever bigger military operation as 1999 progresses. Can you just take us through the briefing of the civilian government? So the first brief, I reckon, from your book was January 99 in Skardu, am I right?
Not at all. That's what people who want to suggest that the then Prime Minister was in the know of his...
Right, okay, I'm not saying it was a full briefing, but
no,
there was
no briefing. I'll tell you. No, there was no such discussion. People who argue that the then Prime Minister knew about it give three, quote three events. One is that he was taken to Gilgit, etc., and the situation was explained to him, Indian firing, etc. But people who are present that I've talked to, they say, well, he was just told about how the situation, can potentially get difficult, that the Indians are there along the LOC, and we can expect, excessive firing, more than normal, etc. Then the next briefing is, he's taken to Kale. Kale is that area bordering Dras Kargil on the Pakistani side. And Pakistan then decides to construct an alternative route there, because what the Indians would always do is when our troops would move along that road, they had vantage points, some peaks from where they'd sit and do exactly what, and they would actually manage to target a lot of our vehicles, etc., and kill our troops. So in a sense, the flip side of what Pakistan was planning to do in Kargil along Leh-Srinagar, they used to do it here, the Indians, and so the plan was to construct an alternative route. So the Prime Minister was taken there and he was briefed on it. And the third briefing was in March 1999, when there's a discussion on upping the ante in Indian occupied Kashmir, and so some kind of fillip is needed for the movement, for the Kashmiri freedom struggle, because the Indians have come down very heavily on the Kashmiris, and it seems like the freedom movement is slowing down. So there's also discussion on Stinger missiles, etc., and then it's discussed and decided that there's no question of giving Stinger missiles, and the Prime Minister says no. So these are the three briefings. So none of these...
None of them refer to this at all? Not at all. So we're now up to March 99.
99.
And there have been conversations, but nothing relating to Kargil, about people crossing the line?
No.
Right. So when did that happen?
Okay, so I think that, so it starts as a small operation where, you'll go in with a couple of hundred, and once it begins to snowball into something larger, because there's this excitement and then this expansion flowing from the original euphoria, and the Indians are sleeping, constructing the Leh Zoo. So when finally, early May, when there's altercation between Indian and Pakistani troops, because once the shepherds go and report to the local intel people, then they tell the 15 Corps, which is the Indian occupied commander. I mean, then there's some response, and then there's the first kind of encounter, and after that encounter, the Indians actually move very fast. They start to remove some of the local people, and the Indian press starts to report that something extraordinary, something unusual is happening. Now this is early May, and mid-May, around 17th May. In fact, first on 16th May, there's a Corps Commander meeting, and that's the first time. Corps Commander meeting, 17th May, is the first time that the army as an institution is briefed on what has happened and, you know, how great it is. And till then, by the way, there's still euphoria because the Indian response hasn't come, but the need is felt to brief the Prime Minister. So on the 17th of May, the Prime Minister is briefed, and, you know, there's this major meeting at the Ojri camp where a detailed briefing is given. Now, two things about the briefing. One, that obviously it's a briefing that's given on maps, which are military maps, and it seemed that the Prime Minister couldn't quite comprehend that there was crossing across the LOC. And it seemed like not many people comprehended that. But things like, statements like, General Aziz said the famous words that, Prime Minister, after Qaid-e-Azam, you will become the most popular man in this country, you'll be Fateh Kashmir. And then, you know, two individuals really speak up. Others claim subsequently when I talked to them that they realized how serious it was. But two individuals, by all accounts, who spoke up and said, you know, what's this? One was General Malik, who was, you know, who had served in that area. And he said, you know, what is this? And this is very serious. We are going across the LOC. And Sartaj Aziz, the foreign minister, he said, what is this we are doing? You know, we are into talking and dialogue with the Indians, and after the Lahore summit, and he had been, by the way, in March and April, he was having you know, conversations with Jaswant Singh Saab, his counterpart, Indian counterpart. So they were, I mean, it would be wrong to say that there was a solution there, but obviously it was always going to be a process. So the process was moving forward. So Sartaj Aziz Saab said, what is this? You know, we are having meetings and post Lahore summit, and the then Prime Minister said, Sartaj Saab, ye कागज़ों से किस तरह से आप कश्मीर ले सकते हैं कि, you know, how can you get Kashmir through meetings and so on, something to that effect. And it seemed that the Prime Minister was,
so is it possible that Mr. Vajpayee understood what was happening before Nawaz Sharif?
Well, Mr. Vajpayee realized that something unusual was happening, but actually not till, no, I don't think that's correct, because the Indian army wasn't registering even what had happened till end of May, until the the MiGs were shot down. You know, one was shot down and the other went back. They violated the LOC. So it wasn't until then. In fact, even then, mind you, the Indian Army Chief, General VP Malik, had gone on a chutti to Poland, and he was still on a holiday. So it isn't until early June.
And then we have this extraordinary conversation, which is even after the briefing, when they've had these maps and it hasn't been terribly clear what's happening, and some people have got it and some people haven't. And then I think it was the next day, am I right, that the Prime Minister calls Ms. Sharif back in and says, have we crossed the line of control, right?
Because after that meeting ends on the 17th of May, as he is going back, the Defense Secretary, a retired general, you know, follows the Prime Minister and says, I need to talk to you. And he says, Prime Minister, do you know what's happened? Do you know that they've actually crossed the LOC? So he says, really? Okay, let's, you know, let's call the general in and talk to him. And then there's the following day. And the reason why I'm constrained to believe this conversation is because the source was the Defense Secretary, who was, as you know, very close to the Prime Minister and his brother of Chaudhry Nisar. And so I've tried, I mean, I don't want to say I've tried very hard to have at least two, three people verify everything that I've tried to document here. So he says that when General Musharraf came and the Prime Minister said, so have you crossed? So General Musharraf, according to him, according to the Defense Secretary, says, General Musharraf said, yes, Prime Minister, and we can, you know, come back if you want. And then the Prime Minister says, well, Dekhin General Sahab, what an amazing thing he's saying. He's accepting, and then he says to General Musharraf, we are behind you, don't worry, we are behind you. But again, I mean, big questions. How do you back off? It's too late in the day and behind.
Right, so the Prime Minister takes a decision. He's now aware, and he said, I'm backing you.
Yeah, and I think that's something that the Prime Minister says subsequently also. You know, he's talked about Kargil occasionally, and he says that this happened, and he says that we were behind the army act because that was in the national interest, it was national dignity, etc. I want to say also that, you know, when we talk about the May 17th meeting where the Prime Minister is given this briefing and his key aides come in as well, and they talk about movement along the LOC, here's where we have to recognize the need to have people at the top who either have competent, very competent teams around them or be competent themselves. Because otherwise, I mean, you know, so the army was smart. I mean, obviously what the army did violated its discipline, that's another debate. But in the context of where we stand today, it's so important to realize that, you know, you can be elected, but being elected along with, you know, being elected, being voted in, comes a whole lot of other requirements if you want to really control and direct policy.
So it's an amazing story you've just told, and it takes us up to the point that it basically broke into the press now, and most of what happens from this point on was documented in the media, and the conflict occurred. So what are the big things then? I can see you shaking. What are the big things that didn't get into the press from
Nothing.
now on?
I mean, essentially nothing got into the press. Somebody like me, I thought this was the Kashmiri Mujahideen, and I was writing articles saying not without Kashmir.
Okay, because the army is still saying they're not there.
Yeah, no, we were getting briefings that it's the Mujahideen, and that on the one hand that it's the Mujahideen, and in fact, what happened was, and why was this line about it being the Mujahideen was picked up, was because these were people, the troops, a lot of them were from the northern areas, and they spoke Balti, Gilgiti. So when the Indians were picking up the intel chatter, they started to say, oh, these are Afghans. These are Afghans. You know. So they started to say they are Mujahideen. So in any case, Pakistan was looking for deniability. This was a covert operation. So a decision was made that we will now say that it's basically the Mujahideen. And so that's the story that was sold. And so this didn't come into the press that it was the Pakistani soldiers. I think around early June, there was greater clarity as to what was happening. And then and you know, how it happened, etc. Nobody, obviously, it wasn't getting into the press then.
Now, the army, am I right in saying, thought, we're there, we've got these posts, and we're in a very strong position here because they're very, very high, they're very difficult to take, we are going to be okay here. Is that what they were thinking?
Yeah, I mean, they were thinking the unimaginable. You pick up any basic literature on military theory, military history, from Clausewitz to anybody, to Sun Tzu, there's the planning principle. There's a fundamental fact there that you always, I mean, I'm sure you people do this in your own personal lives as well. When you go into negotiate, you think, what is the other person going to do? So here the thinking, the conclusion that the Indians are not going to respond the way they did was such a blunder at the planning stage, and so I think that there were other things that had occupied the minds of these four individuals. There was, you know, you've got to settle scores. There's India occupying Kashmir. There's, you know, we know best, and all of that. So, you know, all of that, in all those kind of that sentiment and that desire. Basically, you know, overruled all else. I mean, there was no serious planning involved. They never thought that there's going to be any Indian reaction to this, any serious, substantive military reaction, but they were so wrong.
And the Indians responded in a very big way. And just tell us about the chat that came up at that time of the nuclear element to this.
Yeah. Okay. So. I think that there was one statement that the Foreign Secretary at that point, Shamshad Saab, made. He said Pakistan will use all means possible to defend itself. Because, mind you, when the Indians began hitting back in June, late June, they really hit back. They used the most unconventional ways. They brought the Bofor guns and they pounded the mountain tops. They pounded and they smashed the mountain tops. And they went and, were attacking our young soldiers. And they completely cut off the supply line. So it was a vicious kind of response from the Indians. And so I think that was the thinking that, sorry, what
Nuclear.
is... Yeah, so nuclear, okay. So at one point, and so when the Indians were in full force and hitting back, Pakistan, a statement like this, which was made only yesterday, I think. Yesterday, we had the same statement that Pakistan will use all means, that the Prime Minister has asked the army chief to use all means possible to defend itself in case India attacks. So I think it was the same kind of statement that was made. And then, in Washington, what was happening? In Washington, this was a time when Indian and American relationship was kind of improving, and under President Clinton, they were looking for strategic alliance with India, and that was the first time. And so key people in his team, Indra Firth and a couple of others, had actually decided to, and I say this based on, I met the head of CIA, who was then looking after international security. He was teaching at SAIS when I was there, so I was able to access him. And I've, talked to Milam and talked to General Zini and a lot of people, and Lamfer and so on, Gib Lamfer, who came with General Zini. So I spoke to all these people, and the picture that comes out is that that the Americans, this team looking after South Asia, South Asian affairs and international security, etc., was keen now to use this as an opportunity to get an IOU from the Indians, okay? And number two, they wanted President Clinton's involvement at the highest level as well. So to reassure the Indians how serious we were, how serious the Americans were about the Indians. And I think the Indians played the diplomatic card so deftly, which is what they're even doing now. We can come back to that later. Anyway, so there was no movement. There was this, the Foreign Secretary's statement, and that kind of was taken up in Washington, and the story was kind of spun that the Pakistanis are moving their nuclear weapons, which was ridiculous. I checked everywhere, whether it was the embassy here, the intel people at the embassy here, or whether it was in Washington. And the closest evidence that I could get that Pakistan was involved or so-called involved in moving nuclear weapons was, I remember meeting Indra Firth, who was then Assistant Secretary of State. I went to his office and I said, so, what's the story about the nuclear weapons? And I said, look, I've talked to this person. Everybody says there was no question, and the American sources are saying to me that there was no movement detected, etc. So he got so agitated. He had this photograph sitting on his table. He picked up the photograph and he said, look at this. And on that photograph, there was a map, was a piece of paper, and President Clinton and the National Security Advisor then, and Indra Firth, etc., these 4 or 5 men were poring over that. He said, look, this is where we had discovered that there were nuclear weapons that had moved. So essentially, I think, no, there was, and of course the Indians have said it on record, General V.P. Malik, that we have no evidence that nuclear weapons, but I think the nuclear card was used, it was used by different sides for different advantages.
You think just at the rhetoric level?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think, not that I think, I hope that, based on what evidence we were getting.
And just take us through how it ended then. So we've got the Prime Minister who's made this decision. He's found out rather late what's happened. He's sort of gone along with it and said, I'm going to back you. And then the posts start falling, and he's left with a pretty difficult situation because he's the Prime Minister. He's got to deal with this. And he decides basically to settle.
Yeah, I think that it's not like posts suddenly start falling. I think it's around June when Pakistan is very keen that, in fact, early June there's a meeting in Lahore with the army. And mind you, the Air Force chief and the naval chief were dead against it. There were meetings which were really, very unpleasant, where the Air Force chief, and there was a point where the military wanted the Air Force to come in, and the Air Force said, out of the question. And mind you, the Indians weren't just using Bofor guns. The sorties, the pounding, and some way, in some cases, if you look at Indian sources, read Indian sources, they'll say that the kind of sorties we conducted were even more than were conducted during the First World War, Second World War. They said it was just incredible, the kind of pounding. So there was a point when the Pakistani, there was this discussion, but the Air Force chief said out of the question, and I mean, obviously...
Just to emphasise that, it is one of the remarkable bits of the story that you got in the book, that as you say, this clique, as you put it, the four generals have decided to do this, and the Air Force chief is unaware. I mean, it's not just the civilian leadership. The Air Force chief doesn't know that this is happening, so he's not in a position to make any plans for this.
Yeah, and I mean, even MI and ISI are not in the picture. I mean, it's not just... Right. The Air Force, but even it's much later that everybody realizes what's happening. So, anyway, all this pounding is taking place, and then there's some talk. So there's the formal, discussions that take place, somewhat formal meetings and committees, and then there's the kitchen cabinet, where is this Chaudhry Nisar and the Chief Minister Shahbaz Sharif, and they're very close to General Musharraf, and that's how he gets appointed, right? So General Musharraf is supposedly discussing with them and talking about now rising casualties because the Indians are hitting back, right? So by that time, there's a decision that is made to, okay, now we have to stop this. How do we stop this? So the first thing is that they decide that the foreign minister is going to go to Delhi and discuss some kind of arrangement, and what is said is that we are going to talk to the Indians and say, let's discuss Kashmir, and then we'll bring this to an end. This is 12th of June, and about, I think, 24 of us go along with the foreign minister to Delhi, and about 6-7 of us are sitting in the foreign minister's plane, and I remember that was my awakening, I have to tell you. So I was sitting in the plane, and I said to Sartaj Aziz Saab, sitting in front of him, he was giving us 5 minutes each to talk to him. I said, Bada Zabardast hai. He said, what? Zabardast. And he'd come the night before from Beijing. And then he poured it all out, and he said, I've just come back from China, and the Chinese are saying, get the hell out of there. What are you doing? The Chinese are obviously our friends. They won't say it publicly, but they were just advising Pakistan to get out. And so when we arrived in Delhi, there was a couple of press conferences, and the Indians were saying only one sentence, get out before we talk. You have to get out before we talk. And Sartaj Aziz Saab, he had been briefed by people in the army to say that, there was violation of the LOC in 1983. I remember when some of us were briefed subsequently that, when you talk, you should say that in 1983-84, the LOC was, on 1993, Chor, Batla, and couple of other sectors, that the Indians had violated the LOC. But I mean, you don't wake up to all this 10 years later. So, so he had a very tough time there. He had a really tough time there, and the Indians weren't listening to anything, whether it was Vajpayee said, you've basically, you dug a dagger in my back, and what the hell, and you just have to get out. So it was kind of basically stonewalling. There was no occasion for diplomatic dialogue, etc. And so Pakistan. So when Sartaj Saab came back, then they started to think of alternatives, etc. Then there was a decision. The decision to so there's a meeting that takes place on the 2nd of July. The Defense Cabinet Committee meeting, and that's the first unpleasant interaction where some posts are being lost, and more importantly, the supply lines are cut off completely, and our soldiers, we are losing our young men, brave young men who had gone to fight for a cause. And So at that point, the Prime Minister gets a little agitated. Excuse me. And the army chief says, but look, I told you about this. And he says, no, you didn't tell me. And, what's this, so much casualty? The meeting is then called off, and they're supposed to have a meeting then 2 days later. This is the weekend. 2 days later. What happens, and that very day, I remember going to, I met Mr. Tariq Fatmi, who was the key person of the Foreign Office, the PM Secretariat, and I met General Musharraf, both of them. And both obviously had different stories to tell. In fact, the day General Zini came, I'm sorry, I met them both that day. But I met Tariq Fatmi Sahab, and he said, we are having the next meeting on Monday. And so come up with a final decision. And Tariq Fatmi Sahab says, look, things are pretty bad and casualties, etc. So we have to come to a final decision as to what to do. And that will take place on Monday. And so when, I remember that evening, after that meeting ends, I have friends from Lahore calling up and saying, what's happening? And I'm saying, well, they've got to make a decision, etc. And then at 9 o'clock, on the news, suddenly it's flashed that the Prime Minister is traveling to, I think it's the following day, sorry. The news is flashed that the Prime Minister is traveling to the US. And I remember calling up Sartaj Aziz Sahab, the Foreign Minister, and he said, no, I can't talk to you, I'm just getting ready, I have to leave for the airport. And then I called Tariq Fatmi Sahab, he's at the airport, he takes the call. Okay, so because I used to write on national security, foreign affairs, I had access to these people, I used to meet all of them, etc. So he took the call, and I said, what's happening? He said, no, we are going, and that's all one got to know. And subsequently, it became clear that the Prime Minister made a decision. The Saudis were involved in it also, and the Saudi ambassador in the US was pretty closely involved. Okay, so there was an important event before. The 26th June, General Zini was sent, the CENTCOM chief by the Americans. He had come to basically somehow diffuse the situation. When he came, he was trying to convince General Musharraf to get out. And it remains unclear. I think General Musharraf was keen to leave, but I remember meeting General Musharraf that evening, and he said, yes, I've talked to him, and he clearly said that General Zini understands our position, and he understands Kashmir is very important. And when I flew the next day with Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif to Lahore, I had to meet him. But he was coming, and I said, I'll come by road. He said, no, you fly with me. And on the way, he said to me, he had a different story. He said, the Americans have said, now the place is going to blow up, there's going to be a nuclear war, there's going to be electronic jamming of everything, and what the hell have these people done, and you don't know, we have to end this. He was looking really worried. So there were two different messages I was getting.
Right, so there are various, obviously when you're pulling out of something like that, it's going to get difficult and everyone's running for cover. So, but it ended. And
but it just didn't end like that. What happened was that last, on July 4th it was to end, but 2 days before that, so there was back-channel diplomacy that was going on. Niaz Naik Sahab was sent to Delhi to talk to his counterpart and the NSA, Mr. Brajesh, and the Indian Prime Minister, and he came back to say that the Indians have agreed. And when the Prime Minister Prime Minister was going to fly to China, last-ditch attempt, that when the Prime Minister flies over China, he is going to send a goodwill message to the Indian Prime Minister, and the Indian Prime Minister will invite him, and they will land, then the plane will land in Delhi, and then they'll sit down and agreement to withdraw, etc. Obviously, all of that wasn't meant to happen, and he went to Washington, and the rest is known.
The rest is known. We've got about 10 minutes. I want to get some questions in, but you get the impression that this is a very, very detailed account and a very convincing account of how this decision was taken. Before I throw it open to the audience, can I just ask you, it is unusual, this book in Pakistan, in that I'm not aware of any journalist having given such a thorough account of a military action. I mean, I think it is unprecedented. And how the decision was taken, I mean, down to every meeting. What's the reaction of the military been to it?
Well, first, let me say nothing was given to me. I had to work for years and years to put this together. The reaction of the military, I have to say that some even serving generals have written, but those are WhatsApp messages, to say that, you know, it's that they've appreciated the work, but obviously institutionally it hasn't been. I think that my own, I would feel like my effort has been worth its while if it was picked up in military training academies and reviewed. No, not as yet. That's what I'm saying. That's the real objective.
Yes. Could you help us by saying who you are and where your affiliation is? Yeah.
My name is Nawaz, and mine is a brief comment instead of a question. I think this phenomenon of Kargil was a misadventure by thoughtless, cowardice generals. कोई रास्ता वहाँ से कश्मीर को नहीं जाता. As the honorable lady said that a journal had said to the Prime Minister, how can you take Kashmir by papers? No, yes, we did in the past. Pakistan came into being with the power of paper, because generals don't know ballot papers are made of papers. And just one thing, and we all, these generals ran away by leaving 90,000 prisoners of war in East Pakistan.
Tell you what.
We took that back, just 1 minute. We took those prisoners of war and 6,000 square miles of West Pakistan with dialogue and with the power of paper. And this is a traditional, thoughtless way of thinking of generals, accusing political leadership. Nawaz Sharif was right, Zede Bhutto was right, and
I'm actually going to break
right,
in now.
Pakistani generals are thoughtless, cowardice creatures.
Thank you.
Their only job is to look after
the
operational side of
My name is Shahid Hassan.
I'm breaking in.
They are thoughtless people. They should forget defense policy. We should take Kashmir.
Okay. Thank you. I'm breaking in because.
No, let me just comment on this. I think.
If I could just before you start, if I can just say that we've got Nasim Zehra here. She's written this very, very good book. The questions are about the book. I don't really want comments. I'm looking for questions and questions about the book.
My name is Shahid Hassan.
Yeah.
If you could throw some light on what transpired in the meeting between Mr. Nawaz Sharif and Bill Clinton, and I think Bruce Riddle was present in that meeting, and he did mention that in his book also.
But yeah, I just want to say, I think that I have tremendous respect for the army as an institution, and I think all generals aren't the same. You have had those who went and conducted operations that ended up into disaster. Those need to be criticized, held accountable. Those who conducted coups. But the Pakistan Army is an institution I'm very proud of, and I think that what I can understand, I can understand your anger, but I think we have to start talking about the elected leadership now coming of age and really becoming competent, so you ensure exactly what you are saying, that the policy then should be led by people who are elected. And obviously greater discipline in the army is critical as well. I agree with you.
And Nawaz Sharif.
Nawaz Sharif. Well, as far as the July 4th meeting is concerned, you know, he actually, President Clinton said exactly what General Zini had said. And in fact, when the Prime Minister was flying to Washington, he was told categorically his conversation with Clinton before flying off was just one-liner: you have to get out. And so that's what he said, and I think the Prime Minister wanted some kind of assurance on Kashmir, and the statement that came out mentioned Kashmir and that that the US will try and, help negotiate. But I think that trip was absolutely unnecessary. That shouldn't have happened. But the army chief was on board and also wanted that trip. In fact, he wanted a meeting between Clinton and the Prime Minister much earlier. And in fact, at one point, I think he naively also said, why doesn't Clinton come here? So, well, he says that the Prime Minister was very scared and he was thinking that there's going to be a martial law, etc. The truth is, why should I believe Bruce Rydell? Because they had their own game plan. They had their own, plans and strategy at that point. And mind you that that the Prime Minister asked for Tariq Fatmi to be sitting in the meeting, and he was told no. So look at the kind of situation that we got ourselves in, that nobody from Pakistan could be part of that meeting. There was Bruce Rydell. So you have just the one-sided picture, and it's hard to believe that that picture was entirely true. And all he kept, Bruce Rydell keeps writing, that keeps mentioning that Nawaz Sharif was saying there's going to be a military coup, there's going to be a military coup. And so, I'm not sure that I would buy that entirely. He may have mentioned it.
We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left, so I'm going to take...
Ma'am,
hold on. I'm going to take 2 questions at once, and then you can answer both, and that'll be it. They're here and here, the 2 people with the microphone, so yeah, go for it.
Thank you. I'm Talat Hayat. I'm from Pakistan Air Force. I just wanted to ask, what is one thing, or what are the few things, politically and the militarily, which Pakistan could have, if Pakistan had done differently, this operation could have turned into a success? What are the few things?
Thank you. And one more here.
My name is Asif Khan. I'm from party.
Go for it. We can hear you.
I congratulate Nasim for writing a very bold and one of the best book on Kargil. Only an insider would give such figures, correct figures about Kargil. I just wanted to ask you, do you agree that whenever the civilian democratically elected government wants to stabilize relations with India, to normalize relations with India, army hits back, and army, does such things which are against India?
Okay.
The attack in Kargil. So do you believe that army was aggressor there, Pakistan army was aggressor there, and we were defeated in Kargil?
Should I? Okay. So I think I'd like to take you back to your own government. Pakistan People's Party in government with Prime Minister Yusuf Raza Gilani and Hina Khar as the foreign minister. Relations with India were then improving. In fact, the trade agreement with India was being finalized, and the army went along with that. There was an NOC from the ISI, and this is now based on what people then in the government say. I think that if you go back to that era, you won't see that the Pakistan army was hitting back. I think there are 2 things here. One, so why was that happening? Because there was an institutionalized approach. The National Security Committee was meeting, there were regular meetings, etc. You can't do policy on the basis of personalized approaches. You can't do policy. Now, when Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, when I think that the policy of Nawaz Sharif, the former Prime Minister, was absolutely, on target. The policy was correct in 1999. And so therefore you look at Kargil and you say, this was a blunder, and you have to blame these 4 men who, ironically, by the way, so what happens to General Musharraf after Kargil ends? General Musharraf becomes then, not only is he, he remains Chief of Army Staff, he becomes Chairman Joint Chief of Staff Committee, because that's the time when, Shahbaz Sharif Sahab and the defense and in Chaudhry Nisar go in and negotiate something and try and sort it out, because people have said, why wasn't General Musharraf held accountable? I'm saying the way the power worked was that he got an additional position. But I think that we have to ask ourselves, then what's the way forward? I think it's not good enough to say that because the army has done that in the past. The coups have taken place in this country. The army has violated discipline. The army has led to, the army command, not the entire army command, individuals in that command have created situations which have been disastrous for this country. But the point is, where do you move forward? When Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was in power his last term, for 19 months, there was not a single National Security Committee meeting. My own conclusion on these things is that you can't do policy by individual interaction, by gossip, by tail-tattling and so on. I mean, I think the Dawn Leaks thing is as ridiculous as anything can be, and I'm so glad that the existing Chief Justice finally said it, that if anybody, that's the Memo Commission. He said on the memo thing, how can a state be so weak? Now I'm quoting the present Chief Justice. He said not only 10 days ago that how can a state be so weak that a memo is going to shake the foundations of that state?
Okay.
Absolutely correct. And so similarly on the Dawn Leaks, I think it was a overreaction, but we don't have time, but subsequently I can tell you later on, how the mishandling of that meeting took place. That was an amazing meeting where there was a consensus, there was an understanding, but instead of, holding a press conference and so on. So what I'm saying is the civilians have to understand that their real power lies in, one, being competent, having competent teams, and using institutionalized approach. You cannot have Mittal or whatever that guy was, take him to Murray and think, or call another individual and, Moody comes and attends somebody's wedding or your birthday or whatever. This is not the way statecraft is conducted.
And we're slightly overrunning, but just on, is that your answer to the gentleman from the Air Force, that basically, if you want to work out how to do it differently, you institutionalize these decisions?
Well, I think that, could we have done it differently? And one, I remember, I was at the LSE professor was telling me that when Kargil took place, he said, and he was from the War Studies, King's College, and he said, we had some Germans and we had a class at that point of people from different armies in Europe, and he said everybody was fascinated by this military operation that had taken place. But you can't conduct an operation in vacuum. The international environment, your national environment, and what were you going to get out of it? And the way the Indians reacted, doesn't matter whatever you would have done. Look at what happened to logistics. So it was a disaster, and I can't imagine that this operation conducted in any different way. I mean, there's this argument and debate that continues that if ABC would have happened, we would have won in Kargil. I don't think so. I mean, having looked at everything, this is my conclusion. Others may have a different conclusion.
Can we thank Nasim Zehra for her book and her excellent conversation?